So again, as you're joining in, we're getting ready for our 1 o'clock webinar, and we're just looking for, using the chat function at the bottom, what's one unexpected thing that's come up, whether good or bad, in this season here? What's something good or bad that's been unexpected about being at home? Yeah, I see here not being able to go out in public. I have really bad seasonal allergies in the spring, but I am literally killing myself going outside on walks with the Strava app every day. I need that time outside for sure. We're gonna give it a few more minutes here. It's just 1:02. So as you're putting things in a chat, I do just want to introduce my friend Tanya, who's here on the chat. She's going to be our chat moderator extraordinaire. She has some subject expertise in the benefits we're going to be talking about as well. So I really want to encourage you as we go through the presentation. This is really interactive. So please put your questions there. She'll answer some of the questions there as we go, but also from time to time, she'll break in if there's a question that's really on point. At the end, we're gonna have a large space of time reserved for question and response. So I really wanna encourage you, type your questions now. I don't know everything, Tanya doesn't know everything, so we may have to research some of it during the presentation. So if you type in a good question, we'll start looking things up and have it ready for you at the end. So a couple more housekeeping things as people roll in. You're going to want to make sure you're muted as you come on, mute your microphone. We will have some question and response at the end. Again, you can type those questions in. So just go ahead and mute for now so we don't have that echo. The other thing is we're going to be presenting some information visually for you so you can see it. There's no need to take notes during this. We will have the presentations available on the main website as well as the recording. So I would encourage you to just kind of use the chat functionality. Also, there's a way to get the icons, the pictures on your screen to see who's talking. If you really just want to minimize that to the one person that's talking at a time, that'll be helpful. If you're on a phone, you can switch the gallery view down to that as well. But I would really encourage you to go ahead and shrink that down so that you can get the content. All right. Tanya, anything you want to share with us, unmute, about the chat, or any questions, anything you want to give people before we get going on this?
Hi, everyone. So like everyone else, we are learning about this bill as we go along. I am telling people patience and persistence as you go through this, because for every bill, it then is interpreted, reinterpreted. There are hiccups, there are things that people forgot. And keep in mind, if you read the full bill, a lot of these were a couple of paragraphs. So just as we go along, just a lot of the stuff I may say may be only as good as the day I'm giving it as they try to interpret this. So that's all, but just happy to help any way I can.
All right, so with that, and we've got quite a few people in, I think that's a great lead in to exactly what we're here to talk about today at 1 o'clock. What is it? What is changing? All these laws, $2 trillion bills are passed in 1 week, and then the very next week they go into effect. And so what we wanted to talk about as followers of Jesus, or people that are interested in following Jesus, or even giving helpful information to others, is how do we steward these unexpected benefits in crisis? And so I thought one of the best ways to do that is to turn to scripture and find a time where people were in an unexpected crisis and needing benefits. So we're going to go ahead and go to the first slide and really just ground our conversation today. And I want to do that by keeping us on this question: did God bring us out into this desert to starve the entire assembly to death, right? And that comes right out of scripture in Exodus 16. So before King David, King Solomon, before the temple and the tabernacle, before even the 10 commandments, we get this episode here of these people that have gone through a plague that has killed a lot of folks, and they have survived this plague, and they find themselves out in a wilderness situation. They find themselves huddled together without the things and without the way of life they had become accustomed to. And we find in Exodus 16, starting in verse 2, the story picks up that in the desert, the whole community had started to grumble against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around our pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." And I think in processing in these Zoom communities, something someone said a couple of weeks ago was, had you told me 4 weeks ago or 4 months ago at Christmas time that I would get 6 weeks to sit at home with my family, not have to work, and just enjoy quality time, I would have thought that was a blessing. Now I'm in it, and it's a little, might be a little bit more of a curse, depending on what time of day you ask me with my kids at home. But the idea is that we find ourselves in a new situation and grumbling, or maybe even just having concerns about the unknown. And what we get in this story, if you go to verse 13, is that Moses tells the people, or God tells them, that there is going to be provision, right? God's going to do unexpected provision. And in fact, in the morning, they woke up and there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, these thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. If you're anything like me, you've been following the news, you see one night you go to sleep and you wake up the next morning and they've passed a $2 trillion bill. You know, what is it? What is it? Because we've never seen anything like this. And so it's helpful for us to make three shifts: from the unknown to the known, from self-sufficient to dependent, and from discontent to content. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of unknowns right now: what the law says, what it does. And we're going to try, Tanya and I, to walk you through as best we can as of today what it does, give you some known knowledge. But I also want you to shift from feeling unknown in this situation to knowing that God knew. God knew this situation was coming, and he knew that he was going to work through this situation. So that's the first shift we want to make. And if we can go from unknown to known, it'll help us with the next shift, which is probably the harder one for a lot of people, especially for me. The idea of being self-sufficient, and I go to work, I have a salary, I bring in this money to provide for my family, to this time of uncertainty and needing to be dependent. Dependent on God always, but dependent on things that maybe I had never been dependent on. And if we can make that shift, then we can go from discontent and grumbling to having our needs met and content. So those are the three shifts I want you to be thinking about. And this is the biblical framework we're going to put our context in today. So let's go ahead and just go to the next slide and talk about what is that provision right now. There are 5 big buckets we want to talk about today, 5 big forms of provision. There's a lot more we could talk about. And I'm just going to go in range from the most urgent and pressing for folks to the least urgent. Now, that doesn't mean they're not important, but they're just going from critical right now needs to a little bit further down the line. And the first of those is unemployment insurance. If you've lost your job, we're going to talk about some benefits there and provision. We're going to spend some time talking about emergency paid leave. So if you still have your job, but it's hard to work from home, or you can't work from home at all, there's some benefits there and provision. There's an economic impact payment, a tax refund, a stimulus check. We're going to talk about some of that terminology there, but that's coming down the line in the next couple of days and weeks. And then after that, there's student loan protections and provisions, and finally, how to protect your home in this crisis. So those are the 5 big buckets. We're going to talk about what the program is, who's eligible, and how you get to it. And we're going to keep it really broad. So again, I encourage you to put questions in the chat box, and we're going to tag team those questions. So let's talk about that first form of provision, unemployment insurance. So what's the program? What is it? First, if you have lost a job, or someone close to you has lost a job, or you're talking to someone about it, from now until July 31st, 2020, the federal government has agreed to add an extra $600 a week on top of the usual benefit for your state. So we're in Georgia. I'm going to talk about Georgia. And in addition, they've extended the unemployment for up to 39 weeks. So it's more time you can be on unemployment and more money than you normally would see. And so the big change for a lot of people is who's eligible. Historically, if you've lost your job, you've been laid off or fired and it hasn't been for cause, you can go down to the unemployment office and file for unemployment. But if you were self-employed or a contractor or a gig employee, that wasn't possible. Under this new law, people who are self-employed, independent contractors, gig workers, and others are now eligible for the very first time to get this benefit. And the way to obtain that assistance, unfortunately, is going to be through phone and internet because the local offices are closed. And one of the things we found in talking to people is that the application process was built for the early 2000s, 90s, maybe even the 80s. So we're talking phone trees. We're talking about websites that are crashing. So you're really going to want to be persistent or tell people to be persistent and patient. But the sooner you can get that claim in, the sooner you can get those checks rolling. And the whole idea about this program here is we want to pay people to not work right now. Don't go back out because we want to keep people in. And so that's really the new thing about this unemployment insurance is normally we encourage people, we give you a little money so you can go look for a job. Right now, we want people home safe and not spreading the virus. So that's a broad view of it. As you have questions, put them in the chat and we'll talk a little bit more at the end about some of the specifics and Tanya will jump in. But I just want to give you that first piece. If you've lost your job or your child has lost their job or your spouse, it's really important to file that claim online and be persistent with that. All right, so I want to turn to the next big bucket because a lot of folks are going to find themselves, and this is what they've heard about maybe through emails at work or on the news, is this new emergency paid leave. So what is it? What is this thing we're waking up to? The idea is for the next 12 weeks, the federal government wants to make sure everyone that has a job has the ability to be paid if they can't work, if they can't work from home. The big issue is there's been a federal or state or local stay in place order, or you're taking care of kids for a lot of folks. My wife and I were taking care of our 2 kids. Now, for the first 2 weeks, there's paid sick leave. So 10 days or up to 80 hours, depending on your position, you can get paid full time. After that, there's an additional 10 weeks of expanded family and medical leave where you can get paid up to 2/3 of your regular pay. Now, there are some variations in there, and I'm going to go through who's eligible and how to get assistance. And then I'm going to turn it over to Tanya really quickly just to talk about those 6 different buckets you might fall into. But broadly speaking, the people that are eligible is anyone working for a company with fewer than 500 people. If your company is really small and less than 50 people, they can be exempt. That's up to the company to decide. And then most government agencies are also covered under this protection. Now, this law actually went into effect last week on the 1st. And if it applies to you can start taking that sick leave right now. You're going to want to talk to your HR department or your finance department, but you have until December 31st, 2020 to take that leave. And you don't have to use other sick leave or PTO or pay time before we get to that. So I actually wanted, Tanya, just really quickly, if you can help explain to them maybe what some of those categories are. I talked about, if you have to take care of your kids, but what does that look like, taking that emergency paid leave?
So one of the things I want to be clear about is you're going to have to go to your HR department and understand your HR department's how they actually deal with this. But this is, again, if you have to take care of your kids due to the fact that all of our kids are out of school, if you yourself are sick, or if you're caring for a sick relative. I hate to say this, but as new as this is, each employer may have a slight take on their interpretation of this. But when they say COVID-19 related, again, obviously, if you're sick, COVID-19 related, kids are out of school, COVID-19 related, you have to take care of a sick grandparent. So if you are forced to take leave due to the direct impact of COVID-19. So I'm hoping it's broad, but as DOL starts to further interpret this, I suspect the list may become a little bit more expansive. It seems to be changing minute by minute.
Yeah. So this is one of those questions. I know this is one of those areas where people are going to have questions. Please, I really want to encourage you, if you have a question, either put it in the chat box for everyone or send it to Tanya specifically, because we're reserving time at the end to go through some of these things. So please, if you have a question about how that might work, go ahead. But I'm going to turn to the next area of provision. And this is one that will likely hit most people. I know, I'm sorry, I'm a lawyer, so it's likely, it's mostly, I can never be certain on everything. But this is what's called the economic impact payment. This is what you might have seen on the news or heard on the radio about getting the $1,200 check. So what is it? Well, without boring you to death, it's really a rebate payment from the federal government. So what they're saying is everyone that qualifies will be able to get this tax credit next year when they file their taxes for 2020, but we're going to go ahead and cut you the check now as if everyone qualifies. So that's how the program functions. But what's important for you to know is that if you made under $75,000 last year, or as a married couple or a partnership couple made under 150, you will get the full payment. The full payment is $1,200 per person, or $2,400 for married couples, and $500 for each child you claim as a dependent. So that's important as well. People that made under 99,000 get a partial payment, and couples under 198,000 get a partial payment, and those over the 99,000 or 198,000 will not get a payment at all. We've seen or started talking to some young adults, people that are still claimed as a dependent on their parents' tax returns. Unfortunately, as far as we understand it, the way the law is written, those individuals won't be getting a payment. They will count towards the $500 on their parents, though. And one of the things we've had some questions about is that adjusted gross income, is it net income? How do I calculate that if I'm a gig worker or I'm a 1099? If you have those questions, you can put them there in the chat. We can try to respond in writing, and then we'll bring them up at the end because those are really specific questions. But how do you obtain this assistance? Well, if you filed your taxes this year already, before the COVID virus broke out, because you're one of those people I'm not one of those people, we hadn't filed yet. But if you've already filed for last year, 2019, or you filed last year for 2018, or you or a parent or a grandparent is on Social Security or railroad retirement, probably there will be nothing you have to do. Again, there's that word probably. We don't know exactly how this is going to roll out fully, but if you've filed taxes already and you're on direct deposit, the IRS is telling us that they're going to directly deposit these new funds in your account. That is how we anticipate this to work. They will also, if you don't have direct deposit, mail out a paper check. My understanding as of last reading is that they're going to start sending out about 5 million paper checks a week, starting the week of April 13th. And I have read, but have not confirmed that this link is live, that the IRS is setting up a program that you can go online and put in your bank information if you didn't do direct deposit in the past. So you're going to want to visit the IRS website for up-to-date information on that. Tanya, is there anything you can think to add, just kind of broadly speaking around this area?
Yes, I want to step in because I'm getting a number of questions. So I'll just backtrack a little bit. So I think one of the questions I got about high-risk workers, I may have answered this one, but the unemployment is for someone who is furloughed, who is not working. As it stands right now, it's not necessarily for someone who is currently working, but may be at risk. So that's one. Then I got another question about not doing the gig work. Again, it's someone who is unable to do, it's not about not being advised to do the gig work. It is if you are unemployed due to COVID-19. One thing I do want to let people know, if you are a contractor, if you are a gig worker, sorry, back up one, as it stands right now, the Department of Labor is saying do not apply because they have not updated their applications for the new laws. So just keep checking for those. To go to Sarah's question, the people who are not eligible, anyone that can be claimed as a dependent, if a college student can be claimed as a dependent, they are ineligible for the $1,200 check. And unless that college student is 16 years or younger, they also are ineligible for that $500 as well. So just want to, hopefully, if I haven't captured your question, I'll try to capture it at the end.
Yeah, and these are all great questions, and the things we're trying to figure out as we go, and we're trying to give you the most up-to-date information we can as of April at 1:20 in the afternoon. So I want to turn from the refund payment, the stimulus check, to the next one, which I think For a lot of folks, well, I won't say a lot of folks, for me and my wife and people that are in our circles, we talked a lot about, and it's actually one of the more complicated ones, I think, interestingly, is the student loan relief. And essentially what is happening, or what the Department of Education has said, is that they will give what's called an administrative forbearance to people with federal student loans, and they will stop interest payments on these student loans. Now, this is a super, super specific program though, right? It only applies to loans owned by the US Department of Education. So if you get an envelope every month that says direct loans on it, or some of them from Perkins Loans or Sallie Mae or Nelnet, your loan likely will qualify. There are some loans, these what they're called federal family education loans, or loans that are federally backed but come from commercial lenders that don't qualify. And I'll give you a real life example. My wife and I both went to college, both went postgraduate, we both have student loans. Mine are all direct loans owned by the federal government, so they're income based. We were able to get them deferred. Some of hers came through Wells Fargo. And so when we called Wells Fargo, they said, yeah, sorry, COVID-19, but you still owe us on the 15th of the month. So that's just something I want to put out there. It's really important. So how do you obtain the assistance? We are told that the federal loans are automatically put on forbearance. And so you should see that reflected on your online account or your student's online digital account. My advice to everyone though is check online and then call if you have the time, just to confirm that, because, you know, as Tanya's mentioned a couple of times, these online programs and phone trees are set up for a world pre-COVID-19. They're not really set up for post-COVID-19 yet. And so again, just using myself as an example, I got my monthly email a couple days ago saying that my payment's going to be due on the 15th. And I just called. I was like, I don't know what no, I read the news. It said I don't owe. So you just want to be sure about that. And I just really want to take time to make sure there aren't any questions in the chat box about the student loan piece, because it is important.
Can I make a couple comments?
Yeah, please.
So I was answering questions, so forgive me if I'm repeating what you've probably said. Okay, so it's for federal student loans, but a growing list of private student loan provider servicers, they are offering some level of forbearance. So if you are a private loan lender, just reach out to them. The aspirational date, and I do say aspirational date, that the House and Ways Committee and Department of Labor's Department of Education is putting out is April 10th, which I just want to mention is like this week for the administrative forbearance to go into place. They are stating it's backdated to March 13th. So if you made a payment, they are saying they will refund you, but they're not giving a lot of guidance on what that refund actually looks like. So this is one of those works in process. Some of the private lender websites like Navient, they've already put out April 10th as a date. So just keep updating and understand that if you call in, the information you get is going to depend on the level of updating that customer service person has gotten. So you may need to call back a few times as this is all updated. So just wanted to mention that as some of the stuff I've gotten.
And Margaret, I see your question down here about the last slide and the eligibility. So it's a great question, and I don't want to lose too many people, but the answer is that the refund checks are actually based on a sliding scale of your income. So anyone under the 75,000 is going to get the full rebate. Between 75 and 99, there's a sliding scale of how much you get. There's like a $1 for every something matched there. And then over the 99 or 190 for a couple, then there's no, I mean, it phases out, it goes off a cliff. So that's a great question. It does matter on your income, but anyone under that 75 amount is going to get the full amount. Anyone over 75 and in that gap, that donut hole, they're going to get something. And the reason I left it vague at partial is because it matters how much your income is. And there's a formula that they have going there. So that's a great question. The only other thing I want to mention on the student loans, and I'm actually going to mention it at the end, but it's worth noting here as well. If you have a private loan and they agree to defer the loan or put it in forbearance, I'm not going to talk about the distinction right now. You really want to make sure you understand what's going to matter on August 1st when it comes time to pay again, or however long they give you. Are they adding that payment to the end of your loan where you don't have to pay it, it's just your regular payment in 5 years or 10 years? Or are they going to be expecting you to pay $1,000 on August 1st? So, the 250, the 250, the 250. You really want to make sure if you're talking to a private student loan that you understand what the expectation there is, and specifically around interest on that loan as well. The federal government has said they're stopping interest on the loans, which is a great benefit for someone like me that's never going to pay off their student loans. But if they're not stopping the interest, that might be accruing as well. So I did just want to note that before we go to the next protection. This one I think is a very important protection that people understand. There's a lot of nuance, and I'm talking about everyone's home, but I'm going to split it down into two categories. If you're renting here in the state of Georgia, particularly in Gwinnett County, the courts in Gwinnett and in Georgia generally have suspended all non-emergency cases, period, across the board. So what that means, as we understand it today, sitting here on April 8th, is that they're not hearing eviction cases right now. So if you didn't pay your rent for April, or your son or daughter or your brother-in-law didn't pay April rent, they still owe that rent, right? No one's saying that you're getting a blank slate. Or if you had a tenant, maybe you have a couple properties that didn't pay rent, that money is still owed. But right now, just physically, you can't go to the courthouse and file an eviction case, and the judges aren't hearing eviction cases right now. So for a lot of people, that is like an emergency stop. Like they're not going to lose their house right now in this rental period because they literally can't be evicted by law. Now, the landlord might lock them out, but that's a different call. Foreclosures are in a similar situation where we just don't have foreclosure court right now, but there are in fact certain agencies that have announced that they will not move forward with evictions or foreclosures for a period of time. And those are federal agencies, right? So the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, has announced, and this is who's eligible for it, it's right here on the slide, that they will stop foreclosures and evictions for single-family homeowners with FHA insured mortgages for the next 60 days. They've also directed Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to suspend their foreclosures and evictions for at least 60 days. Now, I'm going to say how to obtain this assistance and then toss it to Tanya because she's the subject matter expert on this. But just generally speaking, you need to contact your mortgage servicer, the company that you make your monthly payments for, and ask for that forbearance, and you need to be clear. So Tanya, what do people need to know, particularly about mortgages, because that's a little bit more specific? Renters don't really need to worry about that at all.
The biggest concern that a lot of us have is what happens after the deferral period ends. So this is particularly if you do not have a federally backed mortgage. If for some of them are giving 90 days forbearance, what happens on the 91st day? I am not getting a clear answer when I've tried to call. I've heard some lenders have said the entire amount becomes due. So just make sure you understand, make sure you are clear. This does not impact your credit. It shouldn't, but just ask what happens in my credit. I know for a lot of people, they may not even be sure if they do have a federally backed mortgage. If you call the mortgage lender, they can tell you. And again, you're going to hear me repeatedly say this. This is patience and this is persistence, because these laws were a couple of paragraphs in an 880-page bill. And for each paragraph, their corresponding entity has to decipher this. So they come up with the law. Freddie and Fannie just trying to make sense of this with the iterations, then that goes to the banks, and the banks have to process all of this. So just make sure you clearly understand what happens at the end of that period. How is this to be reported on your credit? Because the last thing I want is for this to be an adverse action.
That's important. And I think, just if I were to encourage you to think about it visually, the firewall, the big dam right now blocking evictions and foreclosures is that courts are closed, right? You just literally can't be foreclosed on right now. But that is not a long-term solution. That is just a stopgap. And that is county by county, state by state. in a lot of instances. So you really, if you own your home, you have a mortgage, you really want to figure out if you have one of these federally backed mortgages or not. If you do, you want to confirm your payments and payment schedule. If you have a private mortgage, I know, for instance, banks in California are doing some things that are a little bit different. You just want to make sure you're in touch with your bank if it's a private mortgage or a mortgage servicer, and make sure that you're patient, you get things in writing. Keep telling you, get it in writing, get it in writing. Just because you talked to Jim in accounting from Bank of America and he said this thing on the phone and he swore to you the call was recorded for quality assistance purposes, you want it in writing. You want it in writing. So having talked about home protection, I do want to move forward and just really kind of lay some more context here for us. So a couple of words of caution about scams, right? It is important to contact your servicer, whether it's student loan or home loan, before the forbearance is over so that you understand what happens to those skip payments. You've heard us say this multiple times now, and you've heard me say this, get this in writing. It's critical, and the reason we keep bringing it back up is because the law is written and passed, but the rules are in flux. They're changing. Agencies, private companies, employers are writing the rules and policies on the fly. So you really want to make sure you get it in writing. You understand if you're skipping payments, if it's going to come due on that 91st day, all of it at once, if you're adding payments, whatever that is. And I'll just give an example. My wife and I bank with USAA, and we have 2 cars. And so we called them because I do this for a living. And I said, hey, what are you guys doing for COVID-19? And they had a program where they're allowing us to not pay our car payments for 2 months. I was like, okay, I'll take that money. But I wanted to get it in writing, confirming that at the end of the summer, I don't owe them like $900 for all these payments that are stacked up. And in fact, they're just added on to the back of the loan. So I really want to encourage people to be cautious about that when they're doing that. And then the second one, this is important, especially for senior members in our community or our parents that are seniors in the community. Scammers are selling products and services that are free by law for a service fee, or they're taking money and not doing work at all. So what does that look like? Grandma Barbara, my grandma, gets a phone call from Joe who says, hey, there's this new federal program you can sign up for $100. We can make sure that you don't have to pay your mortgage right now. And they either take the money and don't do anything at all, or they just charge people for a service that, if you have that persistence and patience we've been talking about, you could do for free. And we really just want to make sure we're protecting vulnerable people in our communities that are scared right now. They're afraid. They have limited resources, that are doing their best to get by. We want to make sure that they're protected. And if someone's asking for a fee, asking for money to do something, you really want to make sure you know who that person is, how they're doing it, why they're doing it. And you want to go to your bank, to your loan provider, to your place of employment, and you want to have something in writing. You want to make sure you or your parents or your grandparents aren't paying service fees for things that aren't real. So that's important. And I'm going to mention 2 more really quickly before turning it over to Tanya about some other things she's seen. It's going to be tempting, not for you guys. You guys are good Jesus followers. I know you tell the truth. This isn't for you. This is for your brother-in-law who says, hey, I had this idea. It will be tempting to misreport financial or work or family situations to obtain benefits at this time. You just want to resist that temptation to gather on the 7th day, to go back to our Moses story here and gathering that manna on the 7th day. Right now, from what I've seen and others have seen, the question about are you COVID-19 impacted is literally that, right? You check a box on a form, or someone asks you over the phone from your bank, are you impacted by COVID-19? You say, yeah. And that's it. There's no, it's a lot of honor system, back in high school, it's a lot of honor system. My concern for folks is that they do something they think is right in the short term to get access to these benefits, and then later on they have to pay a penalty, or they get themselves in some real trouble, especially with these federal programs. You really don't want to mess with federal programs. That's, thousands of dollars at a time. You don't want to be lying about federal programs, or I'm sorry, you don't want your brother-in-law lying about federal programs and his mortgage and whatnot. So that's one thing you want to avoid. And then the other is more a spiritual thing, an emotional thing. But as my grandmother would say, you don't want to count other people's money, right? You don't want to count their blessings. Remember that everyone that gathers, some are going to gather much, some a little, but when it's measured out at the end, everyone's going to have as much as they need. And what I mean by that is some folks at your job or family members might take part of all 5 of the programs we talked about today. Some might take part of only 1 or 2, or their check might not be for the full 1,200. I would really encourage folks that are followers of Jesus to remember that all good things come from God and that all blessings come from God and that he is the one providing in this time, and strongly encourage folks not to count others people's blessings in that way. So Tanya, what are some other things you're seeing there as well?
Let's see. Can you hear me? Let's make sure. Okay. Unfortunately, I am seeing everything. I am seeing phone calls, give me your name, social, I will get you a stimulus check. Just, it's really unfortunate. And I think someone had come in making sure your check is actually from the federal government. And I hate to even put this out because it's just a shame that this is going on right now. Also, the laws have changed so rapidly that someone can cite what was true a few weeks ago. So a few weeks ago, they had minimums in order to get the check. So I've seen people take that minimum and say, hey, if you contact us, we'll get you past the minimums. Well, since then, that CARES Act came out and totally eliminated that. So just my humble opinion is just, please just follow the IRS website. Just go to the IRS website. My opinion is I will trust the guidance of the people who will push the button and send the check. And there are all sorts of estimated dates as to when the checks may go out, as quickly as Thursday. I've seen the 13th. So keep in mind the dates you are seeing. It's a memo that came out from the House and Ways Committee. I find those dates are very aspirational, but I go straight to the IRS website, and at least the last time I checked, they had not put out specific dates. So we may see it at that time, we may not. But if anyone gets a call, the IRS is not going to call you. If you go on their website, they tell you, do not call us. So just anything you see coming from the IRS, please check with the elderly. They are normally at the front of the line for this, for getting these scam calls, and just ask them, hey, are you getting any calls? Are you getting anything? Just reach out to them just to make sure, because unfortunately they're people's number one targets to make sure that they're okay, not being taken advantage of.
Yeah, that's a great word there. I see the question down here from Beth that I think is a really good question, and one that all of us as followers should really be wrestling with in a real way here about how do you steward the benefits and take advantage of these opportunities if you might be eligible but may not be necessary for you. And I think that's going to be a question that comes down to prayer and discernment and fasting. I mean, prayer, petition, and fasting, honestly. The way it's phrased here in the chat box is it ethical to defer, or some financial advisors have recommended deferring as much as possible to hold on to cash, and that we're all impacted. Do you feel that's ethical or unethical? I think, again, prayer, fasting, petition, always go there first. But as you work through your situation, what I will say is that the law, lowercase LAW, qualifies broadly a lot of people for a lot of provision and a lot of benefits. And that's on purpose, right? The whole idea is, I heard it put this way, and I thought it was really helpful. We want to put our economy in a medically induced coma for 6 to 12 weeks so that everyone can keep on going, and then no one goes out and spreads the virus, and then we can hit unpause and start back up this summer. So with that in mind, these programs are meant to be broad. They're not very targeted. They're meant to inject a lot of money and opportunity into people's pockets and pocketbooks. And so I think that's the spirit of the law. Now, the capital LAW law, the law of God, the Torah, you know that. I would say you can read and look to different things. I think being good stewards and wise with the resources that God gives us is important. When my wife and I talked about it, we went to the Bible. We went to Genesis and talked about Joseph being in Egypt and stewarding resources in a time when there was opportunity to put them aside, to be ready for a time when there might not be opportunity. If you've ever done Dave Ramsey Financial Peace with us on Wednesday nights, you'll know that he talks about all the time having emergency savings, paying down bills on a debt snowball, having 3 to 6 months worth of savings. We're in the unknown right now. We don't know how long this will last. So I think having financial resources available to use if you're eligible for them could be wise and discerning if you fall into that category there. So I think that's a good question. I know that's not a solid answer. It's just a response, but I think it's important that we do talk about that as Jesus followers. So I want to go back to those last two shifts before we open up to questions and answers for the last 10 to 15 minutes. I talked about earlier going from self-reliant to dependent. And really, as Jesus followers or people that believe in God and people of faith, we have this profession of faith that we depend on God. And oftentimes in America and the West, it's in tension with our lived experience in our American narratives of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps or rugged individualism. And what I mean by that is, I've talked to dear friends of ours that have kids our age and, great white collar jobs that have been laid off. And, I had a friend ask me, well, okay, how do I get unemployment? And then, okay, will this impact me in the future? Is there like a penalty or a bar? Will this show up on my credit report? And ultimately, as we talked, we got down to the emotional kind of core for her and the spiritual core, which is, did I do something wrong, right? And I would just encourage us all to remember that no one brought on this contagion. None of us did anyway. None of us can control when it ends. And so to the extent that you can release yourself from the moral, I can't take a handout from someone, or even having provision is a handout. I would just encourage you to release yourself from that idea there, and remember that we all depend on God, that God is the creator, that he is a good God, and that he gives. And so we have to move from self-reliant in the stories we tell ourselves about how all that's around us and our safety and security is based on things that we do, and be graceful people, be full of grace, be full of understanding God's mercy is unearned. And I really want to go from the discontent to the content, because in the story of the manna, the what is it, we see that they gather however much they gather and it's enough. And Paul has this great conclusion to a letter he writes to the church in Philippi. And, just to set the context, he's in chains, right? Like he's been bound. He's not just a slave to Christ and in the word, but he's like in Roman custody. And so he's received this free gift from the believers. And what he says to them in this context is that, I'm not speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation how to be content. I know how to be brought low. I know how to abound. And in every circumstance, I've learned the secret of facing plenty or hunger, abundance, and I can do all things through him who strengthens me. A lot of times we see that on the back of a Nike t-shirt, as my kid is going up for a layup in the basketball line or whatever it is. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. I just think important for us as believers to put into context that this season we're going through, this wilderness season, is something we can get through. It is something we can go through, the highs and the lows, but we can only do that through the strength of Jesus. We can only do that with the provision and grace of God. So I just really want to put that into context as we go from discontent or worry or concern about our finances and John had this great word on Sunday about feeling like your expectations aren't met and God exceeding them in a different way. I don't want to be trite. I don't want to be pat. I don't want to be cliche. Real people are really hurting. And there are some real programs out there to help alleviate some of that, but it's going to take a shift. And so I really want to, encourage us to make that shift from discontent to content. So with that, I think we're going to go to the last section here, which is a question and response period. We really want to give you guys time. We reserved about 10 minutes at the back end of this to do just that. So what we have here is really, we've been curating some questions. And so we want to go ahead and turn it over. Tanya, if there are any questions that we didn't get to in the chat box that you think we should go ahead and do now, that'd be great. Here's a resource library. The information that I went over today is all for free on Georgia Legal Aid. It covers even more than I talked about. You can look at it in writing. There's some helpful 1-minute videos. If you just Google COVID-19 Georgia Legal Help, We help compile those resources at Georgia Legal Aid. Tanya mentioned it over and over again. I will say it again. Department of Labor, IRS, your bank, your loan provider, your local county government. If it's not in writing, if it's in writing from a week ago, you want to check again and just make sure you're looking at that. And then the last point here as a resource, the news and social media is a great starting place. It's a great starting place because you cannot consume everything that's happening as fast as it's happening, but it shouldn't be your last thing you read. You really want to go back to Department of Labor, IRS, your bank. Again, news, social media, your Uncle Charlie, great place to hear something. But before you act on it, you want to make sure you've read it for yourself and an incredible source. So Tanya, questions?
I think I wanted to address Beth's question. I just asked for a little bit more clarification. I have heard this also, and and while you were talking, there were moments where I was typing, so I may be saying exactly what you've said, so I apologize.
Yeah.
But, and I think this is a valid question. A lot of financial advisors are, in fact, and I've read this, they're telling people defer as much as possible. This is my take on it. I don't walk in a fear. This is coming from a fear-based mentality. I serve a God who is exceedingly abundantly beyond math. And if I trust and abide in him, if I trust and abide in his word and what he instructs us to do, then I can walk in that spirit of rest and trust him. So the spirit behind the law, and they are very clear, is deferment is specifically if you are financially impacted by COVID-19. Personally, I believe if you're not impacted by COVID-19 and you are asking a deferral that is specifically for those impacted by COVID-19, that's just dishonest. And there's really no other way to look at it. I mean, they are very clear on that. That is why they are doing this off of the honor system. And if people do this because of fear, as opposed to they are in fact intentionally or impacted by this, they're going to start to pull away from these laws. So to me, it's a matter of honesty. It's a matter of integrity. And I believe if there is a concern, take that concern and that heart to God. He is our source, not our incomes, not the CARES package, and let him write the testimonial for you if there is a fear or concern. So that's my personal answer to that question.
That'll preach, as they say, or that'll definitely preach. Yeah, and I think, that's why we put it in the presentation for you guys. And it's a thing everyone's going to have to wrestle with, but under the avoiding the scams, just be discerning, right? You don't want to indicate that you're impacted if you're not impacted. You don't want to, I echo what Tanya just said, you don't want to be gathering on the seventh day because you don't trust that there's going to be enough, right? I mean, that's the whole point of that story there, is that God is telling them he is going to meet their needs. And in fact, they can rest on that seventh day. They don't need to go out and gather. They don't need to have the scarcity mentality because he's going to continue to meet them in their needs. So that's a great question. It's one that everyone's going to have to wrestle with. And, as you talk to your partner, you talk to your spouse, your in-laws, your family, as Jesus followers, I think we have to stand firm on scripture and spirit. And, we don't obviously compel people or force people to believe what we believe, but I think we have to be, rooted renegades. We have to be biblically rooted in what the scripture says and be prayerful and discerning and wise. So that's great. It's great. Any other questions? And please put them in the chat box. We don't have the answers right now because there are no answers right now. There are only responses. There's only responses. And that's important to keep in mind as these checks start to roll out, as these programs start to come online. If you have questions, put them in the chat box. We can talk about them. And for the last couple of minutes, Tanya, if there's things you've seen, patterns you've seen you want to share, I want to invite you to do that, and I'll do the same on my end.
Okay. The biggest concern that I have is what happens next. And that is for someone who cannot make a car payment or a credit payment. And I mentioned this earlier, it is so important to ask what happens after the deferral period ends, because sometimes you'll hear, I don't know, and I don't know really isn't good enough right now. The last thing you want is to have 3 missed payments that you owe all together on the 91st day. I cannot overemphasize, make sure you understand how it's being impacted by your credit, but the uncertainty of what happens next has been one of my concerns throughout all of this. And keep in mind, they are already working together on a 4th iteration. So there's a strong possibility the longer this lasts that other bills may come out. So even though there may be ineligibility now, that could very well change by next week. I mentioned this earlier, but this is going to require patience and persistence as our Department of Labor, student loans, mortgage companies are rapidly trying to update both their people and their systems to accommodate rapidly changing laws. Expect iterations and interpretations as time goes on. So today you may be perfectly eligible for something, and by tomorrow or even this evening, it may change, or vice versa. So I tell people, don't accept the first answer, because again, these laws are literally paragraphs that they have to interpret. So as they realize they may have left out a people group or didn't consider something, they are rapidly putting out memos, expanding. So it's just a lot of patience as this gets fleshed out. And Marcus, one of the questions I got is, when will this recording be ready?
When the recording will be ready. We will get that out to you guys this week. It's recording all of this, and one of the reasons we want you to put it in the chat is so if we can read the chat out loud and have it recorded audibly, the people that aren't here today can hear the questions, and the great questions you guys are asking. We will make that available on the main website under the content provision there. You'll get a chance to have the presentation. You'll get a chance to have the video recording of all this as well. So if you want to share it widely with other folks, they won't get the opportunity to obviously interact with Tanya and I, but they'll at least get the information and the questions you guys have. So that's important. It'll be on the main website. It'll be under the resources tab. We're also working on some other resources that aren't these webinars. So investment and finances, other capital areas. And I would also encourage people to come back tonight at 8 for the program we have on the spiritual capitals, the 5 capitals. That's going to be great as well. That'll be recorded. So I really want to encourage people there. And then one thing I just wanted to mention, the example of things changing so quickly, even with the stimulus check, the refund check, as recently as 2 weeks ago, they were saying that people that are on disability insurance or retirement insurance or Social Security retirement and don't usually file taxes because they don't have to, would have to file a tax all of a sudden, file a tax return all of a sudden. And that actually changed last week, as far as my last understanding is that no, they're just going to send those checks out directly to people on Social Security retirement or on Social Security disability insurance. That's SSD. Now, I'm going to say another acronym that some of you might know, or you might have parents or grandparents on what's called SSI, supplemental insurance. As far as I know right now, that hasn't been changed. They still may have to file something. But I mean, that's how quickly these things are updating, that one week they can say, no, you have to do something. And then the very next week they can come back and say, actually, you don't have to do anything at all. We're just going to cut you a check. So you just really want to be constantly checking the resources there.
Oh, I do want to mention, thank you. That reminds me. So right now, IRS is partnering with TurboTax. So if you go onto TurboTax, and I'll see if I can find a link and set it in there. If someone who normally would not need to file needs to file, they right now have a way for at least their information to be sent to update addresses, because there are some people who are just on bank. Those who have not supplied a bank account, they are now allowing people to supply a bank account, and they are sending that to the IRS. Like now, this is all really new. I was on the IRS website like while we were talking, just because the updates are coming in, and the IRS is still saying they're going to put out a simplified return, for no better words to put it, for those that ordinarily wouldn't qualify wouldn't need to file. In order for them to file, there still is no estimated date that it actually will come, and they're talking late April at this point.
That's a good word there. And so one of the things we didn't spend much time talking about it is the emergency pay leave and the FMLA leave. I just really want to go back to that because a lot of people now are qualified that historically hadn't been qualified. So if you've lost your job on the unemployment side, or if you still work and they've expanded the coverage for paid leave, you really want to make sure you're talking to HR if you're still employed right now. And I'll just be completely transparent with me. You know, one of my jobs, I was working remotely. I was working from home with our kids, and I was trying to squeeze like a 7-hour workday into 4 or 5 hours while trying to telelearn with my kids and Zoom calls. And it just wasn't working, right? I had to talk to my supervisor and say, hey, you know, I don't want to have to take this leave, but I'm not providing for my clients the way I could. Like me trying to squeeze that time in, like I just need to take 3 hours a day. And so that's one of the things we did at my job. They set up a policy that you don't have to take it all at one time. You can take 2 hours here, 3 hours there. But that's program by program. You really want to talk to your employer, see what they're doing with this federal program if your employment qualifies. Because again, the idea is we want to put the economy, we want to put people's bank accounts in that pause so that when we are able to come back out and not spread the virus again, we want to be able to ramp back up quickly. So I just wanted to put that out there and just kind of be transparent with that, you know, I've never taken sick leave like that a day in my life other than when my kids were born, but I couldn't do the job the way I was supposed to do the job. And so, you know, that was one of the things we had to talk about there. All right, so if there are no more questions, I think what I'd like to do is go ahead and just pray us out and thank you guys for joining us today. I know it's a lot of information to digest. We tried to make it as broad as possible so that you can re-communicate this information, feel equipped to re-communicate this information. But really my heart for this, and you know, I talked to Tanya, we've been having a lot of conversations this week about how to do this in a spirit-led way, a spirit-full way, is just really know that God knew, right? This is not unknown to him, and that he gave us the word, he gave us his scripture so that in times of crisis, we can rely on that. We can have that peace that Jesus gives, and it's not the peace of the world, it's his own peace. So I would just like to pray us out on that note. Heavenly Father, we know that you are good and that you are today who you were yesterday and who you will be forever. And Jesus, your son, teaches us to pray that our daily provision comes from you and that it's your will that's done and that it's your kingdom that is to come. So as everything else around us stops, our work, our governments, the world itself comes to a stop, we know that your kingdom continues to advance. And even though we feel like we are in a wilderness position, that we are out in unfamiliar, uncharted territory, we know that your provision follows us even there, and that you will meet the need, and that we don't have to be fearful because we know we have a good God. And so as we continue to navigate this space in these places, we ask for wisdom, we ask for discernment. We ask that you not lead us into the testing, but if we are going to be in the testing, that you protect us from the evil one, Lord, because you have the power and it's your kingdom forever and ever. Amen.